The doctrine of social redemption was thoroughly rejected by every founding fathers, no exceptions, because it set the stage for what they considered the greatest scourge against humanity. The story of the divine right kings begins a century earlier in England. See, surviving the plagues was both Oxford University and John Wycliffe. At the time, Wycliffe, teaching at Oxford, was influenced by King Edward's opposition to feudal tribute. That's paying the Pope for just breathing. It may not have been a big thing, except that the current king, King John, get this, had rendered England liable for 33 years of back taxes, now demanded by Pope Urban V. See, the real issue here was Pope was in a power struggle with the Florentines and was in dire straits, running out of money and handy conscripts. When Parliament, on top of all the confusion, entered the fray, they declared that neither John nor anyone else had the right to subject England to any foreign power. And it is this standoff that John Wycliffe saw the necessity for government reform. Do you see a comparison with this situation and the situation we currently have with the UN? It is the same debate, isn't it? In that reform, the idea behind the divine right kings was created. It's based upon these tenets. Royal power is through the testimony of Holy Scripture. I mean, after all, Christ rendered tribute to the emperor. And therefore, it is sin to oppose the king, which is derived from God, his authority. Since the law must be in agreement with Scriptures, knowledge of theology is necessary to strengthen the kingdom. And therefore, the king uses theologians to explain Scripture according to the rule of reason and in conformity with the witness of the saints. The idea started here is the larger the authority, the more prone to invasive corruption it becomes. Taking temporal authority away from the Pope and giving it to a smaller jurisdiction of nation kingdoms was tried here first. See, John Wycliffe stressed the temporal role of the clergy on the basis of social redemption was incompatible with the teachings of Christ and the apostles. So you can imagine, this didn't go over very well. And the sharper the strife became, the more Wycliffe relied on Scripture as the basis of Christian doctrinal opinion. And he proved this to be the only norm for Christian faith. And to protect local jurisdictions from such imposed horrors of the Vatican was born the divine right king's experiment. Now keep in mind, what do you think of the Vatican? What was their response? Oh, they hated this guy. Now keep in mind, John Wycliffe was a genius. He was also a bit sarcastic. So in debates, he didn't create a lot of lovers from the opposition. He was the first translation of the Bible into the English common language. He's considered a precursor of the Protestant Reformation. The temporal rule of the clergy, as I said, is incompatible. They should be poor, like the apostles. Now you understand why the Pope didn't like him very much. Because they tried to burn him at the stake 3 times. And each time he was saved by either an earthquake or the Queen. A later Pope was so infuriated that 40 years after his death, ordered John Wycliffe's bones to be dug up, crushed, and scattered in the river. In spite of the zeal of Vatican hierarchy who sought to destroy Wycliffe's original translations, we still have them today, about 150 manuscripts, complete or partial. So widespread were these translations that Wycliffe supporters, called Lollards in England, were often designated by their opponents as, get ready, Bible men. Everyone with me? Ooh. Also, as Luther's version had great influence on the German language, so Wycliffe, by his reason of his clarity and beauty and strength, influenced the English language. With Vatican power diminished, circumstances paved the way for John Wycliffe's divine right concept, bringing power to national kingdom sovereigns, and it was based on the premise that the kings, in the interest of their people, would seek God's will, not their own, and deliver justice and prosperity for the kingdoms over themselves. And history shows that for a while this worked pretty well, until a growing consolidation of power generated a new kind of king. The kings that were generated from this era were not warrior kings like Alfred the Great or Charles Martel. Instead, these kings wore perfume and lace. And as the elites, they conscripted their people to die in private wars of personal conquest. And they gained sanction for their oppressions and cruelty of their own people, mind you, by a corrupt church, which, quote, God ordained them to do these things on behalf of the people, you guessed it, in the name of social redemption. As one historian put it, not since the Caesars of Rome was debauchery covered by such opulence. But you can decide for yourself. The lineage of tyrants reflects the effect of the power of men. Starting with King Louis, it's kind of interesting, he had 200 servants for his bedchamber alone. Mostly parochial nobles that he could keep an eye on. It's interesting to note that Versailles is 1/2 square foot mansion, interestingly enough, with no bathrooms. None. Okay, getting more serious, King Henry VIII, 50,000 Englishmen mourned the death of their family members murdered by his decrees. King Philip, Charles' son, was given Spain and nearly bankrupted the country to try to destroy true Christianity. Charles V was known for the Edict of Worms, banning Luther's writings and labeling Luther as an enemy of the state. But that's not what he was remembered for. In England, he was remembered as the king who murdered all Protestant ministers in Scotland, 18,000 ministers and their wives, in a place called Greyfriars Kirkyard, that you can visit today. Then, it's important to note, comes his descendant daughter, Catherine de' Medici, and she enacted her family's retribution for the reformers challenging the family's papal dynasty. And that retribution targeted the reformers. Among them was John Calvin. Calvin, convinced of the truth of the Reformation, and wrote the Institutes of Christian Religion. Hey, it became a best-selling book across Europe. And it led to 1/3 of the French population converting to the Protestant faith. These Protestant reformers were called the Huguenots, and were described as men and women of noted virtue, a work ethic, and were often leaders in the merchant class and minor nobility. Yet, out of revenge, the new Queen of France started 100 years of maniacal persecution, culminating in the capture, torture, violent murder, and expulsion of every Huguenot man, woman, and child they could find. The impact of her extermination and removal policy was profound. Duc de Saint-Simon in his diaries declared this: "Without the least pretext or any necessity, Catherine, through her son Francis II, depopulated a quarter of the kingdom, historians estimate 400,000, and ruined its commerce and weakened it in all parts." What did we say in the first episode? Tyrants will always persecute true believers. And it doesn't matter what the true believers are in terms of honor and capability, they must be persecuted. And this is a case of that reoccurring again in history. What was worse to our founding fathers was that while she publicly deplored the persecutions, she secretly was an accomplice to the assassination of Gaspard de Coligny, a gallant leader of the Huguenot movement. How did she do this? By orchestrating a marriage to bring the factions together between Margaret of Valois, royal family, and King Henry of Navarre, leader of the Huguenots. When the assassination attempt failed, Catherine feared discovery and urged faithful nobles to murder all Huguenot leaders who were present in Paris for the wedding. The massacre began on August 24th and spread rapidly to every Huguenot home and shop. Even after a tepid royal order the next day to stop the killing, Catherine's henchmen continued, resulting in an estimated 30,000 deaths, men, women, and children. In England, Mary Tudor married divine right King Philip of Spain. That marriage was blessed by the Vatican, and upon her ascension to the throne, proclaimed she would compel none of her subjects to follow her religion, Catholicism. Yet in a few months, by September, the fall of that year, she imprisoned Britain's reformers, beloved reformers like John Bradford, John Rogers, Ripley, Bishop Lattimore, and Thomas Cranmer. Worst of all, she burned 287 Protestant believers at the stake, including married men and women, murdering them sometimes in unison, and one couple was burned alive with their daughter. A pregnant mother gave birth during the ordeal. To have the infant thrown back into the fire. Now you understand from our founders' perspective, when they mentioned Bloody Mary, it was the height of evil of the divine right kings to them. At this time comes William Tyndale, authored the Geneva Bible, the first study Bible containing commentary that helped explain the scriptures. See, it's not all bad. When no support in England came, he went to Germany, never to return. He dodged royal authorities in 1525, started printing the New Testament in Cologne. Betrayed there, he fled to Worms and continued his work. When copies reached England, any that could be found by the authorities were burned at St. Paul's Cross. This is determination. After losing copies in a shipwreck, he starts all over again. Having completed the Pentateuch, he began printing again in Antwerp in 1530. He translated the story of Jonah and revised Genesis. See, the impact of the Geneva Bible cannot be understated. It was a principle to the founding of America. It became the Bible of Scotland. Anyone with land or wealth had to own one. And the influence of the Geneva Bible was something that everyone could understand and take the scriptures seriously, not only for their own lives, but the basis of civil law as well. It was instrumental in deposing Bloody Mary and led the fight against the oppression of the divine right kings for the next 300 years. Then there's Samuel Rutherford, who was a rector of St. Mary's College. Guy not too much taller than I am. I'm sure better looking. But he was an influential writer and thinker. Seeing the failure of the divine right kings, Rutherford writes his best-known work, Lex Rex, the Law, the King. And he argues for the limitations on the authority of the divine right kings. And when the monarchy of Charles II was restored in 1660, it was clear that the author of Lex Rex could expect trouble. And it came with a summons, charging him with treason and demanding his appearance on a certain day. Rutherford refuses to go because he's on his deathbed. And he answers, "I must answer my first summons, and before your day arrives, I will be where few kings and great folk come." Rutherford also has a connection to our founding fathers. It was his principles of just government that were studied and incorporated into John Locke's writings on the Constitution, which were later extracted by men like Thomas Jefferson and incorporated into America's formative governing principles and documents. Facing man's abysmal history of tyranny after tyranny, James Madison sets off to find an enduring solution to government. And he finds that solution in one of the most misunderstood patriots of Western civilization. We will meet him, and he will tell us the secret to limited government. Next time on the Divine Right Kings Experiment.